Welcome everyone joining us online. Today we want to discuss the often hidden but very critical maritime shipping industry and their role in the global decarbonization conversation. To provide some context, shipping is a central node that connects 90% of the global trade supply chain, while emitting about 3% of the global annual greenhouse gas emission, or about 1.5 billion tons, to put that into some numerical context. So when we talk about shipping decarbonization in isolation, it's a little bit like trying to remove an insect tangle from the spider web without shaking up the rest of the web. It really is truly connected to the global supply chain. So we're here today to lay out the upstream and downstream supply chain eco-web that shipping is essentially the glue to, and to look at where scalable decarbonization solutions can and needs to come from in order to build the vision of a carbon neutral global supply chain. I am your host for this session today. My name is Jenny Zhang. I am the product manager at Carbonbase, which is building climate tech software to incentivize companies as well as individuals to reduce their carbon emissions, and starting with helping them to track, report, and offset their carbon footprint. Before Carbonbase, I spent 6 years at Deloitte M&A managing transactions, mostly in technology and logistics sectors. I graduated from UC Berkeley with a dual degree in what is now known as design thinking. So my passion really lies in building products that help to untangle these complex systemic challenges. And so today I have the incredible honor to have a fireside chat with William Fairclough here, Managing Director of Kwong Maritime Transport Holdings Limited, which is the first ship owner to achieve carbon neutral operation in Hong Kong last year. Having started commercial life as a shipbroker, Will went on to co-found Mandarin Shipping in 2006. In 2016, he was appointed Chief Commercial Officer and elected to the board of the Hong Kong ship owning group, Kwong Maritime, before assuming the role of Managing Director in 2019. And Will and I, we share the same philosophy that we have to measure what we want to manage. And we're both committed to helping achieve a data-led pathway to a fully accountable, transparent supply chain with shipping really at its heart. So without further ado, let's get into the chat. I've got a few questions I wanted to ask Will to share with us his experience from the industry. So starting from the upstream, shipping decarbonization, when we talk about that, really what we're talking about is energy decarbonization, as the main source of emission from shipping is really the fuel consumption in order to move all of our goods that we order online or the buildings that we build around the globe. So as an industry, since the first question is, can you shed a bit light on where we are on the alternative fuel vessel research pathway, and what are the relative pros and cons? Essentially, what are the different options we're looking at?
Thank you, Jenny, and it's very nice to be here. I'm very happy to have this discussion with you, and it's a good place to start. The alternative fuels needed to power the shipping industry are much debated at the moment. The International Maritime Organization, which is the United Nations body that oversees shipping, has started to put in place more and more regulation to try and shift or reduce the carbon impact of shipping, in particular the emissions that come from the ships. So the technology that we use to drive ships has not really changed for many years, and it's very reliant on heavy fuel oil, which is traditional hydrocarbon diesel, marine diesel oil. The focus at the moment is what are the lower carbon and the zero carbon alternatives. The transition fuels at the moment that have actually been produced and where their technology exists are focused predominantly on something like LNG, and LNG does have a lower carbon impact when you consider the fuel having reached the ship to actually being burned. But I think the problem comes when you look at the whole supply chain of the fuel itself, and that's where there's a lot of debate, because of extraction of LNG, especially if it comes from, say, a shale well in the shale basin in the US, for example, you get a lot of methane slip. And we have to focus, I think, really on the underlying problem, which is to reduce the carbon emissions and carbon equivalent, CO2 equivalent emissions. And methane has a much higher greenhouse gas effect than CO2. So there, I think, is some debate about whether LNG is a significant step forward. I think, like many things, the answer is it depends. The type of engine technologies that's used, where the LNG is extracted from, the distance that the LNG is carried from extraction to the source, where it's actually put into the ship. And, all of these things can produce a result that is worse than the current fuel supply chain, or about 20% better if it's done properly. There's obviously a challenge into making sure it's done properly. In terms of, looking forward 10, 20 years, maybe even to 2050, where, we have obviously targets to reduce our emissions. I think the low carbon alternatives focus mainly on ammonia. There's very high profile container company Maersk that have recently started a project in methanol. And of course, you'll probably all ask the question, well, where do these fuels come from? And I think that is the unanswered part of this debate. Hydrogen is obviously used as one of the alternatives. There has been an increasing side of the debate suggesting that atomic, which is effectively some form of small nuclear reactor, has a part to play in a totally carbon neutral or carbon free, sort of shipping future. And I think, just digging down, it's about where the fuel comes from and looking at the whole supply chain of the fuel. Let's just ignore the supply chain of shipping. So ammonia has to be green ammonia. Obviously, ammonia is something we've been using for many years. Predominantly, most of today's consumption of ammonia is used in fertilizer. But its production involves natural gas and is very carbon intensive, and it's not any form of a step forward to use ammonia as it's produced today. So to produce green ammonia, we need vast amounts of renewable energy. And just to give you some idea of the scale, and I'm not completely on top of the data myself, but effectively we would need to produce more solar. If you just look at solar and wind today that's produced in the world, would need to be a factor significantly more than we produce today, just to produce enough green energy, green electricity, in order to make green ammonia to power the fleet. There was a report recently that suggested it was actually about 20 times of the renewable energy we produce today would need to be produced in order to produce enough green ammonia. Now, of course, that leads to all sorts of other questions. Is that the most efficient use of that green energy? And I think it may become a theme of this little discussion we're going to have, is that talking about the solution to these problems in isolation is not that helpful, because it ignores the fact that, as you mentioned at the beginning, shipping is responsible for only about 2.5 to 3% of total emissions. But if we are to replace all of the vessels that are used today and power them with green ammonia, well, that would include a vast amount of vessels that are carrying coal and oil. And arguably, that's not the best use of, the sustainable electricity that would be needed to produce that ammonia. So I think it just goes back to the whole integration of the supply chain and how we look at each fuel versus what the actual ship is doing. And I think the likelihood is we'll have some sort of combination of different technologies, and the technology debate is still very much open and is raging, and becomes a little bit at times becomes sort of quite polarized, which I think is just because people have to make large investments, and once they've made those investments, then they tend to tend to want to support the approach that they've taken. But I think it's far from settled, and it's an open debate that keeps raging.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So as you mentioned, it really is it's a lot of moving pieces in terms of the different options we have from alternative fuels to electrification to renewable energy. And the real solution really needs to come up with essentially lining up all the ducks in a row to really achieve this sort of well to tank and well to wake emission reduction. So you mentioned investment, and I think that's exactly where I want to go next, which is shipping, energy. These are all super capital intensive industries, and any scale transition will cost billions, if not trillions of dollars. And eventually this cost will need to be passed down the supply chain to the market for the end consumers and companies and brands who are eventually benefiting from a greener consumption, a more protected planet. So the question really is how do we find ways to help the rest of the supply chain upstream to reduce these green premiums along the way? So if we look at the very end of the supply chain, where the brands and the customers sit, because they're the ones that are getting the stuff that are inside the container ships, for example, from your point of view, where is their willingness or what level is it at to pay this premium for greener logistics? And that could be anywhere from slowing down the ships so that they're less carbon intensive at a lower speed, all the way to completely offsetting or carbon neutralizing the shipments or even the product on board themselves. Where do you see this sort of level of willingness at in the market?
It's an incredibly complex question, really, and could have an incredibly complex answer or set of answers. But fundamentally, the demand from the consumer for a more sustainable supply chain is evolving and is gathering pace and strength. I think every day we all see that. I think one of the sort of issues about, or sort of one of the positive sides in some sense of the pandemic, is that it has shone a little bit of a light on the importance of shipping within the supply chain. And there's a couple of events. I mean, the Ever Given, when that huge container ship was stuck in the Suez Canal earlier in the year, did more to raise the profile of international shipping than almost anything else in recent years. And suddenly it was front page news, okay, arguably for the wrong reasons, but it led to an understanding that shipping was that sort of vital link in the supply chain. And I know I can speak certainly from Europe, and I think maybe the same case in the US. There are certain goods now that it's very difficult to get hold of as a result of the congestion that has been caused by the pandemic, and getting goods to market and certain types of things where the capacity on container ships is very, very restrained at the moment because of the shift in spending patterns brought about by the pandemic, which is much more towards buying physical goods rather than services, and had a huge impact on the container sector and the availability of container shipping capacity, which has meant certainly quite high volume goods are now no longer available on a sort of what a consumer would previously have expected, that sort of time frame. So I think it's highlighted that vital link that shipping plays. And I believe that combination of the consumers and regulators and the governments, and I know in the UK they've started to talk about that reluctance to import somebody else's carbon emissions just through simply buying something that's produced elsewhere in a carbon intensive manner. I think we have to expect that that will just become a more and more important point of difference for goods, in particular certain types of goods. In some markets, of course, in the more developed markets, I think that that's a much stronger trend than in developing and obviously much under less developed markets. But how you then link consumer behavior to the price of actually a lower carbon supply chain is a very difficult challenge, because it starts, I mean, you're talking about the consumer end, and the consumer obviously is close to the product, and that's quite close to the liner shipping industry, the container market that we just talked about. The opposite end is the raw materials that are obviously extracted from mines, are shipped from raw material form. Just to take the sort of crudest example would be iron ore, which is maybe mined in Brazil or Australia and is shipped on a large bulk carrier to a steel mill, maybe in Japan or China, produced into certain steel products that are then shipped again to factories and to further, sort of downstream production facilities, then actually fabricated into finished goods that are then put back on a container ship or a car carrier or whatever it is and brought to market. Now, we're a long way from the consumer having any understanding of that full supply chain and of the data that actually relates to the emissions and to the sustainability, because it's not just about emissions, it's to the whole sustainability and biodiversity of the supply chain at that very raw material end, which is so many stages removed from the actual act of going into a car showroom or going into a supermarket and purchasing something. And that is fundamentally where we believe there needs to be a huge change in the next decade. And that's really our target. And I'll just sort of paint the comparison to the first question you asked as, and it's a argument that rages in any shipping forum you'll care to go on at the moment, is what is the fuel of the future within the next 10 years? Are we going to be having a fleet of ships burning ammonia, or is it going to be burning hydrogen or something else? And I think that to me, it's a personal view, and I'm delighted always to have an opinion, and if it's wrong, I don't, that so be it. But I believe that it's actually having data and proper measurement of the full impact of the supply chain, which ultimately links all the way through to consumer, every single one of us, is the most important and achievable challenge of the next decade. Because we now have technology that can help us to measure each stage of the supply chain, and shipping, as you mentioned, is a small part of the emissions, maybe 3% of total emissions. But if you actually focus on what's in the ships, just as much as you focus on what's coming out of the ships in terms of the emissions, what's in the ships, the cargo is a tremendously important part of, in fact, the vast majority of all of our consumption is represented through the cargo that is transported on our ships. And so that provides a number of opportunities on each leg of the shipment to actually start gathering the data as to what then happens to that cargo. And there needs to be much better collaboration between the different industries. And I think this is part of that challenge, is sort of cross-industry collaboration with a sort of united in a single goal, which is to make the supply chain a much more sustainable one, and to help consumers to alter their behavior. But you can't expect consumers to demand or to actually alter their behavior if they don't have the information to hand. If you can provide them with accurate data as to what is the real impact of buying this product over this product, of consuming this material over this material, of eating this food over this food, when we truly understand that, then you'll see that consumers can alter their behavior accordingly, and regulators can actually make the regulations that will help to drive that behavioral change. And of course, economics plays a big part of that as well.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of regulations, there are, I just want to bring to the audience landscape overview of the different bodies that are influencing shipping policy and industry coalitions that are trying to push decarbonization conversations forward. So for example, the groups like the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which is the UN agent essentially setting international shipping policy around safety and environmental performance aspects of the industry, as well as industry coalitions like the Poseidon Principle, which is one of these cross-industry collaborations that you mentioned, as specifically between the shipping industry and the finance industry, as a joint effort to come up with a framework to assess and report on sustainable ship financing and to promote that across these two industries. So how do you see the interactions between the shipping companies and these kind of groups? How is that helping to facilitate the decarbonization transition?
It's an interesting sort of geopolitical balance. Traditionally, the shipping industry is not particularly well represented within the United Nations. Effectively, the IMO is subject, it's quite a controversial thing to say, but it's subject to all sorts of lobbying influence, and you tend to have more concentrated lobbying influence within certain industries. I give an example is the oil industry. So when we had this switch from high sulfur to low sulfur fuel that took place in 2020, in fact, the new regulations were not particularly well supported by the shipping industry. I mean, the shipping industry tends, if you look at it as the industry that owns the ships that are responsible for the emissions, that's not the same thing as saying the owners themselves are responsible for the emissions, because most of these vessels are chartered out or leased out to the traders and the oil companies and the commodity traders that actually ship these finished goods. So the actual cost for buying the fuel is actually not something that often falls on to the ship owner. It falls on to the trading companies that are responsible for chartering those ships. And the oil companies were very happy being able to sell heavy fuel oil to the shipping industry because it's a part of the refining process that it's effectively a byproduct, and they didn't want to lose that market. And so instead of switching to low sulfur marine diesel oil, which is effectively a slightly higher grade of fuel, the oil industry were able to successfully lobby within the through the IMO, through the United Nations, in order to get a slightly watered down version of this change, which was that you could continue to sell high sulfur fuel, but ship owners would be obliged to install a scrubber on each and every vessel. Now it's nuts, really. I mean, the way that this should have been dealt with, if we want to remove sulfur from the fuel, it should have been removed at source. But ship owners themselves, I mean, it's something I've often said before, the four biggest flags responsible for over 50% of the global shipping fleet are the Marshall Islands, Panama, Liberia, and Hong Kong. And collectively, those four countries don't have a huge amount of influence within the IMO and within the United Nations generally. Those four countries don't have a huge amount of clout, whereas the sort of collective lobbying power within, say, the oil industry, and we can see the difference in, say, the airline industry. And this moves us on to a recent change in regulation regarding the emission trading scheme within Europe. Now, within the airline industry, the ETS has been introduced for some time now, but initially it was proposed that it would apply to all flights in and out of Europe. But actually, the airline industry, who have obviously a lot of national representation and a strong lobbying, they are a strong lobbying group when they get together, was successfully able to argue that this actually put a lot of European carriers at a disadvantage, because if you had hub carriers outside of Europe, for example, in the Middle East, then for long haul trips from, say, the Far East into Europe, if their flights were to stop at a Middle East hub, then of course the only part of that flight that we were responsible for the emission trading scheme cost would be for the flight from the hub into Europe, whereas European carriers would say, have direct flights from the Far East straight into Europe. So after a significant amount of debate, the emission trading scheme for airlines only applies within Europe, for flights within Europe. Now, the same legislation has just been announced for shipping, and effectively the European Union have become frustrated with the pace of change, or the pace of regulation, or the ambition of regulation by the IMO. Now, the IMO have a very difficult job because they represent, it's a United Nations body. It's represented by every nation in the world. They have to reach consensus, and they obviously, the individuals all strive for the same thing. We all want a more sustainable supply chain, but politics gets involved in these situations. But the European Union decided to press ahead on shipping within the emission trading scheme, and they recently announced that it applies to shipping for all voyages in and out of Europe, as well as inter-European voyages. Now, the implications of that are still unknown, because we haven't had enough time to see if there's going to be a change of behavior. But of course, if you have a voyage from, say, China or the Middle East into Europe, then 50% of all of the emissions in conjunction with that voyage, if one half of that voyage is European, so from China into Europe, 50% needs to be offset through the European emission trading scheme. And that's a very significant cost, especially for certain categories of ships, very big ships that have high consumption, big container ships, large LNG carriers that are bringing in natural gas for power consumption in Europe. And of course, that's going to be a huge additional cost on those particular shipments. Now, one of the implications that has been suggested is that this may lead to a shift or a change in trading patterns that puts the European market at a disadvantage, European players at a disadvantage. For example, you may get hubs emerging just on the edges of the European Union. So, just for example, and the economics, I don't know if they work yet, but this is what everybody's looking at: is you end up shipping a large amount of oil, gas, or container, or whatever it is, and then you have a transshipment hub in, say, North Africa, and then that can produce smaller shipped shipments into the European Union to save on the cost of the ETS. Now, that's just an example of how the regulation is starting to bite, and that at the moment it's not necessarily being applied evenly. Now, I think generally the move within the shipping industry itself, and it might not be the correct thing, because turkeys don't always vote for Christmas, but it is that it should be a level playing field. I think the European Union have decided to press ahead because they're frustrated and they want to ensure that there is a cost to be paid. I think the question mark to some extent is, what is the revenue side of that cost, of that tax? Where will that go? And it's not really being used to develop, a portion of it, but it's a relatively small portion, and it's not particularly transparent. Will be used to develop the new carbon technologies. But of course, most of that will just be effectively a tax into the European Union countries. Now, the problem I think that many people have is the concept of a carbon tax is fine. If you want to change behavior, you can put a tax in place to alter behavior, but there has to be an alternative. And it comes back to your first question, which is, what is the alternative fuel that is available to shipping today? And the answer is, today there isn't one. And we're working very hard on it, but the cost of it is, huge, and also unknown. And the reality is, within the next decade, there's going to be a very, very limited number of vessels that are able to burn alternative fuels. But it goes back to looking at the whole supply chain rather than looking at shipping in isolation, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. That I think that just shows there are a lot of these different government bodies that are trying to push the direction in a certain direction, but really what we need is consensus and fair playground globally, because inherently shipping is such an international industry, right? It doesn't belong to any one country, it doesn't belong to any one flag or one industry even. And this interesting point you brought up about the sort of revenue and cost side of switching to alternative fuel or upgrading your ships. There is another interesting avenue of ideas, which is around the concept of carbon offsets. And actually, an example of this is companies like, say, CMA, for example. They have employed biofuel blend on certain portion of their container vessels, and in order to help gap the cost differentiation between that and the traditional bunker fuel, they've actually created essentially internal carbon credits that they can sell to their container customers to help bridge some of that cost gap. So, and that's essentially in a form of biofuel carbon credits. And my understanding is that this product idea is taking off partially because the container market, due to the pandemic, has been experiencing an unusual heat wave, if you will. And but how can we make incentives like this sort of last beyond the cyclical nature of the shipping market, so that we can continue to invite customers, downstream corporates, financing, and other parties to support these kind of transitional steps that companies are taking to reduce their carbon emission?
Ultimately, it comes down to the consumer, and consumer demanding a certain standard in respect of information, data, what is the true carbon footprint of the goods that they consume. And with that information, then they can start to make a choice, and they can start to influence behavior. Market forces can be used to start promoting a more sustainable future. One of the advantages, I believe, of a carbon offset model now is it starts to establish a cost pathway from, say, the shippers. I mean, you can go at any different part of the supply chain, but ultimately through to where it should be recognized, which is to the consumer. Now, shipping could go carbon neutral tomorrow using an offset. Controversial, people wouldn't agree with it, might not work. I mean, there are many different reasons why it's not going to happen, but ultimately the reason it's not going to happen is because of cost. What would happen if every single ton of CO2 was offset through shipping? I don't even know if there's enough offsets available in the world, but just assume there was. Tomorrow, it would obviously drive the cost of shipping up, and that would ultimately drive the cost of goods up. But what is actually very noticeable, if you start to do approximation of the maths, and I won't say that it's a very complex issue, but we have looked at it, and because we've looked at it together, is that the cost on each individual finished good, an item that ends up in the hands of the consumer, is remarkably low. It's actually very, very affordable, but that's for shipping. And as we've talked earlier, shipping is only about 3% of the total global emissions currently. But that could be and would be extremely affordable if it was distributed across the entire consumer base for all of the goods, because shipping, emits 3%, but it carries 90% of pretty much everything, and arguably you would then say, you could infer that it's the majority of the emissions are actually at some point of the cargo transferred through the ships, but it's 90% of everything in terms of consumer goods that goes through ships, whereas only 3% is due to the transportation element. And that is a useful concept, I think, in terms of causality and in terms of understanding this link between the consumer and their consumption. And I think this is something consumers need to become more aware of. But it's one of my particular bugbears that the shipping will have a lot of debates within shipping forums. Each sector of the supply chain will have their own debates about how they decarbonize. But ultimately, I think in isolation, those conversations are certainly not meaningless, but they're not nearly as effective as if they are conducted across the supply chain. Given shipping's importance and its universal nature in almost all fields of consumption, I believe that the shipping voice should be represented on every single different discussion that's taking place, almost all of them, because it's the hidden, but it's actually tremendously important. And I think people are starting to realize that a little bit more. But dealing, as we have been debating within shipping, with the emissions challenge that we've got in isolation, and trying to produce enough alternative fuel using green energy in isolation without thinking about what's in our ships, I think is almost starting to become a slightly meaningless discussion. That may be slightly flippant, and I think some people would challenge that, but I just honestly believe it, because I think we have to really look at quality. And I think that is one of the benefits of an offset, is because it starts to actually apportion cost, and whether the cost is accurate and correct, that you can debate that elsewhere. Is our carbon credits correctly priced to truly price in the externality of all of the the emissions that are produced? Ultimately, a market price can be found, but I believe that economics will play a huge part in the transition anyway, because I think that there's increasingly more and more information to suggest that if you remove the subsidies that are implicit to a lot of hydrocarbon consumption, both mining, extraction, oil, diesel consumption for a lot of industrial activity, the total government subsidies for hydrocarbon consumption are enormous. They're in the trillions of dollars worldwide. And if you remove those, or you have to play on a level playing field, and you have to recognize what's the true cost of solar and wind versus coal in terms of power production. And I believe we're going to start to get there as people start to dig behind why the subsidies there. It's intensely political, of course, because you can't just remove those subsidies. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of jobs that are kind of that. So governments have a huge challenge ahead of them. But ultimately, the economics of it is becoming more and more compelling, that coal as a source of power production is actually not the most cost-effective way of producing power. And as we get improved technology in solar and batteries, then you're going to see a movement away from coal. And then, of course, that has a profound impact on shipping, because we're shipping less coal, and so you need obviously less ships. And so, to argue in isolation for any of the actors within the supply chain, I think it just rapidly becomes very meaningless. But I do believe that at this stage, we're an early stage of companies being able to offer a more sustainable product, and consumers being willing to pay for it. And you cited an example by CMA. I think that that is something that will, as a trend, become will grow. And I think COP26, which is happening really very soon now, has a huge role to play in what Paris did for governments and setting targets. COP26 in Glasgow, I really hope will see, private enterprise companies, corporations, banks, the sort of not the governmental but company involvement in progressing and accelerating that decarbonization across our industry. And that's going to have profound implications for shipping, ultimately, because if the rewards are right and the fear of regulation is there, the private sector is much more efficient generally than the government sector, and it can happen much more quickly. So I think we will have a real acceleration over the next decade, and that's going to have a huge impact on shipping, but not necessarily in all of the ways that I think people think. And part of that is the consumer demanding a much more information and a more sustainable option, because it's one thing having information to say, okay, what does my consumption cost the planet, so to speak, but I want to know then how I can do something, what's the alternative? I still want to, consume item A or B, but I want to consume it in a more sustainable way.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect, wrap up to our session today. So if I can attempt to summarize, we've covered a lot of ground in a very complex system of challenges facing not only the shipping industry, but really the global supply chain. Is that, if we look at it in the longer term, what we need is a lot of investment into energy transition, shipping technology to try to get that 3% down as far as we can, and utilizing renewable energy in the most efficient way. But ultimately, the consumer, the global consumer, has to be responsible for what they're purchasing and essentially requesting logistics to move around, right? So if we're continuing to, only in this one way of going for the cheaper and the faster and the linear, then it'd be very difficult for the supply chain along the chain to try to individually reduce their part of the emission. And part of facilitating that awareness and providing consumers with the choice and the transparency, access to product footprint information, I think is what we're working together on and thinking of the different solutions around. And in terms of solutions, so short and medium term solutions, carbon offset is this one type of tool that is trying to put a granular cost, sort of the true cost of emission and carbon, on each step of the process, whether it's on the 3% of what ship burns out of the chimney, or the 90% of what the ship is carrying on it. So in either case, I think shipping industry is the places key role as a node in this global network to help other industries and governments track global emission patterns, because it truly is this kind of almost like a hidden intelligence network that really is the physical manifestation of globalization and global trade, because everything at some point moves around on a ship. So with that, I want to give a big thank you to Will for spending time with us today and sharing a very comprehensive system overview around shipping decarbonization, but also the larger supply chain conversation. And this is definitely, we're only at the beginning of this conversation, and the panel today is really hoped to inspire more conversations in and outside of the shipping industry, and I think to advocate most importantly for local industry around decarbonization, because it really isn't any one industry or company or individual's issue to be solved. It really does take on. So thank you so much for sharing with us today, and we hope everyone have a great rest of the morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Hi, everyone. For those of you who are online, thank you for joining us tonight. Apologies for the earlier technical difficulties, but really happy to see the people who managed to meet us here. So want to answer any questions that you guys might have around the topics discussed. It's quite centered around shipping, but also it's really a larger question around the global supply chain and responsible consumption in general. So let's see, a question coming in, carbon offset piece. So the question is, I'm curious about the carbon offset piece, how you can make sure the shipping companies are being transparent about their sustainability strategy. Thank you for that question. I think it is a really good question. I think the industry is trying to put their fingers on it. There are a couple different ways, and most of it really comes back to data connectivity and the sharing of that data. So there is a company called TradeLens. This is not only to the carbon offset conversation. It's sort of shipping in general, because to simply ship something across the ocean, there are probably dozens of companies that have some kind of input or request of data around that shipment. So that includes obviously the sender receiver, but also the ports, the insurers, the charterers and the subcharterers. So data transparency and sharing, I think, has always been an ongoing conversation and challenge in the industry. And there are companies actually, including Carbonbase, but there are companies actively working in this space. So example being TradeLens. So that company was a joint effort between IBM and Maersk that launched a few years ago that is leveraging blockchain to connect the shipping documents around all these different stakeholders that I just mentioned, and we're hoping to connect those solutions more to the carbon offset and carbon tracking piece of it, because if the charters and if the charters and the customers are already aware of the fuel consumption, then it's not a very difficult link to convert that into the carbon consumption figure, and then as well as to the carbon offset piece of it. So I think the long-winded but short answer is that it definitely is still something that is a work in progress. Yeah, so I have another question coming in. What can consumers like us do to encourage shipping companies to be more sustainable? That is also, so the CMA conversation, that the CMA biofuel offset is, I would say, a step in that direction where they're trying to pass the sort of action of offsetting shipping carbon emission down the supply chain, so to the charters. And there are also other options, say on Shopify, where they offer the carbon offset app, where you can essentially toggle and choose to offset your shipping when you buy something through Shopify. And there are a few other, I think, e-commerce platforms that offers that. So that's one place to start, where you can, as a consumer, you can essentially inquire and ask the brands that you're buying from, what are they doing, where are they getting their shipments, because the shipping companies themselves might be a few degrees removed from the end customer. So from an end customer perspective, the closest link we have are to the brands that are shipping, making, and selling all the products that we use. So it's really up to us as consumer to then voice out that question and say, what are you doing to manage and be transparent about the emission? And another point to add to that is, if we look at sort of step back and look at the larger context, right? Shipping typically is a very tiny percentage of both the cost and the carbon emission of a finished product, right? So I remember seeing a stats where, say, if a pair of sneakers costs $50, it's about 50 cents of that is shipping. And so that also gives you kind of some scale around in terms of, as end consumers, where can we sort of ask the company to focus their effort, right? So, and that's also something that Will and I talked about at length, which is perhaps the more effective way to go about it is to say, instead of, because the current sort of linear and global economy, how it works is, you would, in order to say, make an iPhone, or you're taking minerals from Africa and you're manufacturing in China and you're selling it in the US. So the same product sort of goes around the world. And that's what creates a lot of the transportation and logistics emission. So as consumers, if we choose products that are manufactured more locally and just in a more circular fashion, that is perhaps a more direct way to contribute to the overall reduction of emission, rather than sort of asking companies to then asking their shipping companies, because transportation and logistics really is a result of where companies and consumers choose to purchase and make their products. So that's, I think, due to time, we have many other exciting panels coming up for our Climate Week lineup. So we do want to wrap it up around here, and we will be sending out links to recordings for those of you who joined us later in the session, so that you can catch up on all the good stuff in the beginning. And we'll also definitely be putting in our contacts, so that if you have other questions that we didn't have time to get to tonight, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk to you more. So with that, I'm going to close out this session. Thank you, everyone.